How often do you dream? What are they like? Are your dreams filled with daring adventures, supernatural powers, and people you'll never meet in your real life? Or do you end up in weird situations, such as falling in love with a leather couch? To exactly show off a dream isn't easy for movies, though we've had a few that have done them well. But there's one particular movie about dreams that not only gives one of the best examples of dream logic itself, but the history of the entire film is something to behold. Let's get into the wild existence that is Little Nemo: Adventures in Slumberland. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am your ever-friendly Pokeprof, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction. Before we get into anything else, there's one interesting thing that I'm wanting to bring up. A lot of the people I've seen who've watched this movie or are aware of it don't know the original source of where Little Nemo comes from. So I'm wanting to establish that before we get into the movie itself and the process of insanity that led to its creation. It all started back in 1904 with a cartoonist known as Winsor McCay. Being a creative individual growing up, he was well known for creating a number of popular comic strips when he joined with the New York Herald, with Little Sammy Sneeze and Dream of the Rarebit Fiend being two of his most well-liked works at the time. It's this second collection of comic strips where Nemo first appeared with his signature flying bed, going through the sensation of it rocking back and forth before the last panel reveals it to all be a nightmare brought on by him eating minced pie. This was kind of the focus of the Rarebit comics, of a character having a bizarre dream or nightmare coming about from a bad meal that would often explore darker parts of these characters. And while I can't find the reason for why Nemo's own segment proved popular or favored, eventually McCay made a comic centering on the character, titled Little Nemo in Slumberland. The focus of the story would be Nemo traveling throughout the land of dreams to meet the king of Slumberland and eventually become a playmate for the princess. Though in a lot of cases, the comic appeared to be designed to let the artist take the readers anywhere he can think of, with places like Mars, Jack Frost's palace, and a land of funhouse mirrors being an example of places Nemo visited. Like the dreams themselves, many of the concepts, characters, and events that took place tended to be surreal, unusual, and would play on the stuff that would often take center stage in our nightmares. While popular for its time, enough to encourage many other artists to look into the land of dreams and what they might entail, the idea was mostly left alone outside of other dream-based and inspired properties, such as Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. The movie we're here to talk about would be the first time since the early 1900s that the series would gain any real traction again, spawning video games, comics, and even a live-action adaptation of the idea called Slumberland that was released in 2020 on Netflix. Don't ask me anything about that, I have no idea. I didn't even know it was a thing until I started doing research here. Now, one of the more interesting things we'll talk about the movie itself is the fact that there are two distinct versions of the film. The one that I saw as a kid and that most people would probably be familiar with was actually edited down, removing a grand total of 11 minutes of the film. While these removed scenes are mostly extra animation with bits of the more darker or violent moments of the film that were cut to help it get a G rating back in the day, there's at least one moment I'll like to point out that does add extra context to the film. The first 5 minutes of the movie have a lot to unpack with them. Not only because this part of the film is probably the most faithful you'll see to the original McCay comics, but also the fact that it's the perfect example of what to expect from the movie itself. It starts off light-hearted, Nemo waking to find his bed flying throughout the city, becoming enthralled once he learns how he can control it. It shifts over into a nightmare shortly thereafter, Nemo finding a dead city before losing flight and being chased by a train. The rest of the movie feels like this, with the first half having a lighthearted nature that takes a sudden sharp turn halfway in. I should also mention that this segment is where we actually see a little bit of that wild history of this film really coming into focus. You see, the original idea for the movie itself came from Yutaka Fujikawa, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, who was the president of the Japanese studio Tokyo Movie Shinsa, otherwise known as TMS. He had a dream of making a film that could compete with Disney at the time, employing a bunch of well-known animators to help bring that idea to life. Among these were Hayao Miyazaki and Yoshifumi Kondo of Studio Ghibli fame, years before it was made. The entire opening segment of the movie is cherry-picking a lot of those original elements to use for the final product. Between that and the fact that it was originally released in Japan means that you can consider this movie an anime. Kinda. Because that was the other major thing that Fujikawa really wanted for Little Nemo, that it would be a joint project between Japan and the States, to the point where the list of names that were involved in some way include George Lucas, Ray Bradbury, Brad Bird, and the Sherman Brothers, to just name a few of them. It's the brothers that would probably be the most lasting impact, considering several songs made its way into the film that are heard throughout it. After this opening sequence though, we get properly introduced to Nemo, a young boy, and his pet squirrel Icarus. We see the pair of them getting excited for a circus that has arrived in town, complete with clowns, elephants, and more. Despite his desire to go when pleading with his father, he's told that maybe tomorrow they'll have time to go do it. Though the implication here is that maybe tomorrow is something that his father says quite often, and yet never quite fulfills. Now I'm bringing special attention to this next scene here. This is the scene I was talking about before that was cut, but adds extra context for the film, showing Nemo pretending to sleepwalk and steal a bit of pie. There's a note on the fridge that informs him to remember his promise, and I want you to all make a special note of that. Otherwise, we can understand why it was originally cut from the film, as on its own it does feel kind of pointless. It's only after this point that we really get into the true crux of the film, as in the middle of the night, Nemo gets woken up by a bunch of guards coming into his room along with a tall man and his clown companion. This is where it really hits us that from this point on until the very end of the film, we're in a dream world, and this is perhaps one of my favorite parts of the entire movie, because everything that we saw Nemo experience from the previous day gets a role in his dream. The tall piano player and the clowns from the day before take the form of Professor Genius and Bon Bon, there to escort Nemo to Slumberland. We later see that the circus has influenced Nemo's view of Slumberland, with many of the citizens there to greet him being dressed like clowns and having bright colors, though this is also about as close as we're going to get to some of the original designs of the comics as well. The professor here also takes elements of Nemo's father, as we see this by his need to be on time and carrying around a pocket watch. This is also where we meet Flip, inspired by the clown that knocked Nemo over at the circus's parade, voiced by the biggest voice actor in the main cast, Mickey Rooney. Flip here is a bit of a troublemaker, described by the professor as a frightful fellow, which is something that I found a bit funny in my research for the film. You see, Flip's original purpose in the comics was to wake Nemo up, going along with the idea that a jolt or fright is enough to get us out of a dream. While I do feel like it's a throwaway line, I couldn't help but think that it may have been done with the intent of being a nod to the character's original origin. Flip here is actually where the dream logic fill of the movie really comes in for me. While yes, at this point we've had just silly things that you can really only accept in a dream, such as the upside down room and the ride down the spiral staircase, it still holds that slight touch of reality to make it feel like it's believable. Flip's influence, on the other hand, feels like it pushes the boy into situations he'd otherwise avoid, like how we sometimes make choices that we never would in dreams. This feels especially apparent when Flip just vanishes entirely in the eventual meetup with King Morpheus, inspired by the ringleader of the circus, and his daughter Princess Camille, inspired by the girl riding the elephant. Sadly, this is where a lot of the cracks of the film come into play, and it's the weakest part overall. From this point onward, it's mostly about showing off the art and music, which, while beautiful and catchy, lack the substance that it really allows us to sink our teeth into the film. And if it wasn't for the behind-the-scenes troubles that I know the film had otherwise, I would say that this was an intentional choice to give us a dreamlike feel of something that could vanish before us if we looked at it more closely. But the simple truth of the matter is that nothing here was really worked with any sense sense of cohesion to it. Like, at one point in the movie's development, the artist said that they were simply drawing what Bradbury was writing at the time, while the author himself stated that he was simply writing what the wonderful artists were drawing. Story-wise, the most important thing we get is the fact that the king has decided that Nemo is going to be his heir to the throne, gifting him a golden key and making him promise that he'll never open the door that shares the key's symbol. Of course, being as young as he is and having the bad influence that is Flip about, Nemo opens the door, which reveals the existence of the Nightmare, who always gave me Hexus vibes from Fern Gully. This results in the kidnapping of the king, and Nemo waking up after trying to deny that he was responsible for opening the door. This is where that remember your promise point of the scene I was talking about before comes into play here. Remember, the scene was never in the original American release of the film, only added back in when it was put into the DVD years later. And while the actual importance of it isn't something that's all that great, considering we already knew that elements of Nemo's life were being put into his dreams, it does really bring forward one of the major themes of the film, taking responsibility for one's actions. It's from here that the rest of the tone of the movie changes, going for darker shapes and colors, with Slumberland in particular looking dead after the loss of their king, and our characters eventually heading to Nightmare Land to try and save him. The problem is, at this point, we've gone through half of our film's running time and we still don't feel like there's much progress or work done with any of the characters. Heck, you want a good example of just how impactful things are in this movie? After their initial introductions, Nemo never once calls the professor or the princess by their names. He just refers to them by their titles. We also get introduced to our last bit of characters, known as the Bumps, who help guide our characters to the Nightmare Castle, also wanting to go there to save their fifth member of the group that didn't make it out. That plot is nicely derailed when Nemo wakes up a second time, the fifth bump conveniently getting dropped in by the dream to help Nemo win the day by giving him the ability to defeat the Nightmare King using Morpheus's magic scepter. Something I only just now realized I never mentioned at any point during this entire episode. That's the real problem we're faced when it comes to this movie. The simple fact that it's got a lot of interesting and even solid ideas and characters, but it doesn't really do much with them. Part of this does come from the valid reasoning of, if it's all a dream, what's the point in the end? Yes, the entire point of the movies is the fact that Nemo's becoming a better person because of his dream, but it never feels impactful, especially when our main character is calling out the fact that he knows he's in a dream at this point. You might be able to look past that if it wasn't for the other problem, simply the fact that nothing in the world or with the characters are all that developed. We've got good ideas for them, such as Flip being a troublemaker, the princess being a bit snobby at first before becoming nicer, and the king being fatherly, but none of the characters are really given more than a few scant minutes to really show off what they can bring to the table, especially when Nemo keeps getting sent back to his room in his waking up phases. The movie did pretty horribly when it came to both of its releases in Japan and America, with Fujioka taking full responsibility for how badly it did, and flat out retiring from filmmaking shortly thereafter. It would go on to become a cult classic thanks to VHS and DVD sales, but even the most diehard of fans will usually say it's enjoyable to look at, but there's nothing substantial beyond that to offer. It's that right of its history going through so many years of hell and the legacy behind Nemo itself that usually what catches most people's interest. That and what you can find left over from it. Remember how I told you that the opening segment of the movie cherry-picked a lot of the elements from Miyazaki and the others? That's because the Proto-Ghibli crew had made their own pilot for the film to give Fujioka and others some ideas of what they wanted to do. This and two other animation pitches have popped up over on YouTube over the years, showing the different art styles and ideas that were worked on and attempted to get into this film. It shows that while the ending result may have been a dud, there was passion behind the idea, a desire to do something wonderful that was there. and nearly every person involved in the film at one point or another went on to do good things, or had already done so. It very much feels to me like a reverse Halloween tree in a way, especially when you consider Ray Bradbury was also involved in the making of this film. If you're curious to see the film in its entirety, TMS has actually uploaded the entire thing unedited up on their YouTube channel. I say it's worth the watch at least once for the artwork and to see what happens when so many different ideas, people, and intents affect a film without any clear focus. While the end product does give us a dreamlike feel of a world that doesn't quite make sense to the waking mind, it's one that isn't completely intentional. An enjoyable watch and one that I think fondly of, but Little Nemo for most might be a dream that doesn't linger long in your mind. With all that said, I hope I've done a good job to entertain you, and I'll do my best to do so again in the future. Hopefully you'll follow along with my content by subscribing and doing all the other things that gives us YouTubers life. If you wish to support me a bit more, I do have a Patreon where you can get access to bonus content. But until next time, stay frosty.